Hello, this is Mike at Gamefromscratch, and today we're going to do a brief introduction to 3D graphics applications. If you're interested in creating 3D art, this should be a good starting point for you. We're basically going to look at what the major graphics packages in the industry are. We're also going to take a brief look at history, which shows how the industry got to where it is today. It's actually somewhat important to understand how things developed into what they are. So if you're looking at getting into 3D, this should give you a nice overview of what your various programs available are, what everything does. We're not going to go into details on using each program. In fact, we're not going to see any of these programs in operation, but we will be linking to them. The majority of these programs actually do have a trial available, so you can jump in and take a look. There's also on the Gamefromscratch.com webpage this exact same thing we're about to do, but in text form, as you can see it in front of you right now. So if you want any of the hyperlinks that we've got here, I'll be linking this below in the comment section. So hopefully this is interesting to you. So let's start in right away with a brief bit of history. More or less, if you go way back to the beginnings of computer graphics, they were used in early films like Star Trek and such, but around the rise of probably Terminator 2 was about when we first started seeing realistic graphics packages, like where they were actually creating images that were almost unrecognizable as computer graphics. Now, if you look back at these movies today, it's pretty terrible in some ways, but some of them actually are holding up fairly well. But that was about the point where the industry started to make good enough for film work. And if you go back in time to those days, there was a couple of major applications. Two of the biggies. One was from a company called Alias, and eventually Alias Wavefront, that was called Power Animator. Another major one was called Softimage from a company called, predictably enough, Softimage. Those were the two big used 3D applications in the graphics space. So if you're working on a movie or very, very far back, a game in those times, a lot of people were using either Softimage or Power Animator. Now, Softimage ran on a number of computers, but generally back then it was on digital DEC, like basically workstation class machines that cost $15,000 to $20,000, whereas Power Animator was running on SGI hardware, which would run anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000 for a computer. At the same time, a license for these programs was, again, $10,000 plus. So back in the old days, only a very, very small number of people had access to these programs. Price was a huge barrier, and that's one of those things that definitely changed over time. Now, at the same time as these programs, Softimage and Power Animator were nailing it at the theater, there started to become a bit of a, I wouldn't say home user type market, but definitely a smaller market that were trying to run on commodity level PCs. Back then, one of the real leaders here, and the one that was actually used for the most production work, was a program called LightWave, made by a company called NewTek. They used to actually sell a bundled version of the Amiga computer with NewTek LightWave installed on it called the Video Toaster, and this was actually used for so many early commercials. Most famously, it was used for the Hercules and Xena series of TV shows, as well as Babylon 5. It was a very successful program that you could get for, a studio up and running, probably $4,000 or $5,000 back in the day. There was also another company called Autodesk, which you may or may not have heard of. You will have by the end of this video, but Autodesk was mostly known for making a program called AutoCAD. AutoCAD is computer-aided design. It's what architects and engineers use for designing stuff. It's about as far as you can get from game development these days. However, they did have a product called 3D Studios. No Macs, just 3D Studios, and it ran actually initially on DOS, 640Ks of RAM, and it was several different programs together. I believe it was about 4. So the modeler and the renderer and the animator and all those things were separate little programs to get under the memory restrictions. This program was not cheap. It was $3,000 or $4,000. I personally bought a copy, educational copy, for about $200 or $300 back in the day, which was pretty revolutionary. But again, you could get one. You could get into working with 3D Studios for DOS for about $2,000 machine and a $3,000 license. So for about $5,000, you could have a home working workstation. Now, compared to the Power Animators and the Softimages of the day, or more aptly to the SGI and DEC boxes of the day, home PCs stunk. They really, really stunk. But they did start getting better. Early on, we saw things like Glide API for 3D effects video cards. We started getting 3D acceleration into the market, and Microsoft saw this and thought, we want in on that. And essentially they bought their way in. They bought Softimage. And what they were doing at the time is they were working on Windows NT 3.5. And if you don't recall back, NT used to be the server version of their product. They all merged together around Windows 2000 and then split back out again, oddly enough. But they were trying to get into the workstation market. And the number one way to do it would be to get the graphics crowds over there. So they bought Softimage outright, ported it over to Windows, and at the same time, OpenGL was becoming more of a thing. That's actually why Microsoft has any OpenGL support in the first place, is because they wanted to be in this 3D market. So like I said, they bought out Softimage, ported it over to Windows, and it worked wonderfully. Nowadays, Windows is the market for workstations. SGI is, I'm not even sure it still exists. I know Cray bought it a number of years ago, but I think it is just completely non-existent. Alphas no longer exist, so basically Windows won that market 100%. And they did it, again, by buying Softimage and porting it over. Around this time, there was also another company called Intergraph. Intergraph was known for making workstations for graphics. So those two together, working together. So NT getting better, Softimage being ported over, and then Intergraph making really cool workstations that were competing with SGI and digital all helped. And then at the same time, you started seeing things like NVIDIA, mostly NVIDIA actually, slightly lesser degree Matrox, making cards that were actually capable of running these applications. At the same time, 3D Studios became 3D Studios Max. This is the Windows port of it, plug-in based 3D application. And if you use 3D Studios Max today, the 3D Studios Max version 1 versus 2015 really looks similar. There's a lot together under the hood, and that's kind of where it all began. So there was a move towards commodity hardware, making this stuff affordable, and so on and so forth. And the nice thing is, it worked. Things came over to Windows, and prices started to plummet. And prices plummeted to a level that it's kind of amazing what happened. A number of years back, 5 or 6 years ago, Softimage and Maya. Maya is the predecessor of Power Animator. So way back in the day, there's a company called Alias/Wavefront. So it was two companies that merged together. Alias Wavefront made Power Animator. Eventually, they remade a version called Maya. Maya was the one that ran on SGI, and it ran on, SGI's operating system was IRIX. It ran on IRIX, and it ran on Windows. And that was the beginning of Maya that we know today. So Maya is kind of a rewrite of sorts of Power Animator. So you had Maya from Alias, which they ended up calling themselves. You had Softimage, which Microsoft bought, and eventually, once Microsoft won the server market, they got out of it, and they sold it off to a company called Avid. So you had Avid making Softimage. You had come on, Ray. You had Avid making Softimage, Alias making Maya, and then you had AutoCAD or Autodesk, under the name Discrete or Kinetic, they keep changing it, releasing 3D Studio. So you had these three major programs, 3D Studios, Maya, and Max. And there was a race to the bottom for price point. It was a wonderful time to be alive. Now, 3D Studios never dropped in price. It's always been about $3,500. It's actually always been exactly $3,500. However, Maya went from being $20,000, $30,000 type thing down to being $5,000, and then down to being available for under $1,000. It was pretty awesome. At the same time, Softimage, I believe, dropped. There was something called Softimage Foundation, and it was available for about $400 or $500. Like, so you could get into 3D as cheap as it ever could be. Problem is, all these companies were also hurting for this. They were also creating game-oriented versions. And it's a shame this kind of went away. It was a very cool movement, didn't last very long, but Autodesk created something called Gmax, which was a version of 3D Studios Max for modding. At the same time, Softimage released something called Mod Tool, which you may have used if you've ever done any Source or I think Source Engine is the only one that really used it. Source development. Mod Tool was a version of Softimage that was available free. Microsoft XNA also had a bit of a deal going with Softimage where you could get a version for like $100 or $200 for their licensing fee. So we had this massive race to the bottom for price. 3D Studios was $3,500. Softimage and Maya were like under $1,000 and going down. Now, you still had to buy more and more and more, so those could still be very expensive packages, but the entry-level price point was getting down to the point where it was cheaper to buy your 3D software than it was to buy it was cheaper to buy the software than it was to buy the hardware, and that wasn't working. All of these industries were actually really starting to hurt for it, and ultimately what happened is Autodesk bought everything, and that's where we are today. Autodesk owns Maya, and Autodesk owns Softimage. Now, traditionally, those are the big three packages. So if you're thinking about getting into 3D today, there are three packages to mostly be aware of commercially. There's 3D Studios Max, there's Maya, and there's Softimage. Now, the reality is, sadly enough, there's actually two packages now, because in 2015, the last version, 2014 technically, the 2015 version of Softimage was released, and this is the last one. So now, here's where we stand today. I'll just go across the web pages. These are all linked from that article I'll link below. So if you want to get in and do any of the trials or anything for any of these programs, they are available in the links on the linked page. But the first one we've got here, there's Autodesk 3D Studios Max. 3D Studios Max is, and always has been, sort of for the home PC market. And its specialty, where it really found its niche, was games. And I would say to this date, the majority of commercial games come out of 3D Studios Max. Now the reality is, especially since Autodesk owns all three, you can actually move between each program pretty easily. There's a format called FBX, and it's internally used between all of their programs, and then some of their other software, the non-3D stuff they've got on offer as well. So you could now have an art house that used 3D Studios Max for some artists, Softimage for a different artist, and then Maya for post-production, or whatever. Like, it could all fit into the same piece. It's still problematic switching between, but when the same company is providing the file format behind them, moving between them wasn't as big of a risk as it used to be. So where you used to see a studio that specialized in one piece of software, you moved a bit away from that. However, ultimately, when it comes to games, when people go, well, what am I going to use for games? 3D Studios Max was by far the leader in that regard. It's an interesting package. I mostly used it when it was first released. I've come back to it a few times and just see how it's evolved. It's in need of a rewrite, to be honest. It's still got a lot of the cruft that goes back to like version 1. There's meta ball and spline modeling stuff in there that people just, or freeform lattices that people just don't model that way anymore or work that way anymore. So as they added more features, they never took all this old stuff out. So there's a lot bundled in there, but ultimately, game studios generally use 3D Studios Max. That's not to say, however, that it isn't used for films. It is. And that's not to say that it isn't used for television or visualization, or it's used for all kinds of industries. But the niche that it probably is known for is games. So if you're interested in games, the commercial piece of software that is most used out there is 3D Studios Max. Next one up is Maya. As you can see from the websites, and here's the reality of it. Autodesk owns them all, and they're slowly kind of mushing them all together. See, Maya brought out a hotkey set, for example, the QWERTY keys to do your selection, your move, your scaling, all that stuff. And it was nice. And now everybody under the sun does it. And that's what you're seeing over time. Is 3D Studios Max will add a feature, Maya will copy it. Maya will add a feature, Max will copy it. We were seeing that before they were owned by the same company. Now that they're owned by the same company, they're slowly kind of merging into the same-ish product. And saw a little bit of that with Softimage as well. Now, Maya is probably known a bit more for film work. Its interface, compared to everything else, it's very mouse-oriented. If you're not a mouse fan, you'll probably not be a big fan of Maya. But for animation, special effects, that kind of stuff, Maya is probably superior to Max. For modeling tools, low polygon work, you could argue texturing. No, definitely texturing, actually. Maya is inferior to Max. So there are areas where they're strong and they're weak. Maya is used for games, but mostly for films. Max is used mostly for games, but also for films. However, the barrier is blurring. So if you use Maya commercially, you should be fine. You use Max commercially, you should be fine. The fact that they're owned by the same company and they speak the same language makes the entire point almost moot. So for the commercial games that you're seeing out there, I would bet you it's pretty safe to say that 90% of them were created in Max or Maya. And if I was to break down the numbers there as a pure guess, I would say it's probably 2-to-1 Max versus Maya for game development purposes. But Maya is definitely strong there, and Maya for animation and texturing, animation for sure, effects, rendering, that stuff, it's nice. For things like compositing scenes, that type of stuff, that's where it's definitely superior. Now, the next one in the list that they offer is a program called Softimage. Softimage was a weird program when it started. It's a weird program today. I kind of liked it. I never really got into it. I only ever messed around with it a bit. I'm sad to see it go. At the end of the day, though, Autodesk bought all three, and the writing was on the wall. I don't think there's a Softimage user alive right now that thought that Softimage was going to make it to this day. And I wouldn't be sort of surprised, I hate to say it, that eventually either Maya or Max go away. It may not happen because they've got a slightly different focus, but when they had all three packages, it was inevitable one was going to go. And Softimage was always kind of the quirky neighbor. But at the same time, Softimage was very loved by the people that used it. And Softimage was used in films from day one, and it's been used by a number of very high-profile game developers in the past. So it will definitely be mixed, but if you today are looking for a package that you want to learn about, Softimage is not the way to go, because sadly, it's dead. And I'm not even sure. I tried around on Autodesk's page if you can even buy it anymore. They're not releasing any new versions. They're going to be supporting it until 2016, but I don't even think they're selling it anymore. So Softimage isn't even really an option anymore. It's kind of sad, but that's the way it is. So if you're thinking about starting with Softimage, don't. So those are the big three commercial, and amazingly enough, as it started, they were all separate companies in the beginning, and now they're all owned by Autodesk, for good or ill. Now, I talked about how we got into a golden age for pricing 5 or 6 years ago. Before Autodesk bought all these things, everything was getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. However, it's not all bad now. Some of these things have actually, under Autodesk's rule, have gotten a lot better. Now, the one big thing that we've got is there's now a version of Maya called Maya LT. It's about $750, and it's a stripped-down version of Maya, the full version. And what they've tried to do is basically just give you the stuff you use to make games. And that more or less means 3D modeling, texturing, and animating. So no rendering, no compositing. I don't think there's particles in there. Yeah, that's about it. So all of these stuff, it's basic animation and then all your modeling and texturing tools. So if you just need to make 3D assets for your game or level design or whatever, it can be had for $750 or something like $30 a month, as opposed to the full price for Maya. Oh, yeah, I guess we should talk about that too. That's another one of the advantages of the merger, sort of. When they first came together, the pricing was all over the map. 3D Studios Max has always maintained about the same price, about $3,800. When Autodesk bought Softimage and Maya, they'll jack the price of both those up around the $5-6 grand mark. It got really expensive. Now Softimage is gone, and Maya is the exact same price as Max, so a little bit under $4 grand. Now, what has changed there is you can now buy monthly. It's about $180 a month, so it's certainly not cheap, but it's a lot easier than a $4,000 all-at-once bitter pill. The other major change, and there was an announcement of this just yesterday. I'm recording this on December the 2nd. So just yesterday, Autodesk announced that they were going to make it completely free for educational. And that's a big move there. So if you are a student looking to get set up, there's a nice thing. You can get into Autodesk products completely free, and there's a ton of them beyond just their 3D stuff. It used to be more or less people just pirated. You know, people that were learning this stuff, or they bought the educational versions like I did decades ago, and even they were kind of rare at the time. So now, you know, all the products are under one roof. There's no price war going on anymore, which is unfortunate. But there are also more options for students to get in there for free. There's monthly purchasing prices. There's the LT version for the indie development on Maya. So it's a bit of a trade-off either way. But that's Autodesk. Autodesk kind of owns the professional industry. Like I said, probably 90% of the games are being made with Autodesk products. 90% of the films are being made with Autodesk products, and 90% might even be a low number. So definitely Autodesk is winning this particular game. However, if the idea of spending about $4,000 on a piece of software doesn't really appeal to you, there's Blender. Now, Blender gets a bit of a negative reputation for being hard to use, and the reality is it used to be. It certainly used to be, and today it's different. It's a very keyboard-centric workflow. However, once you get it, it's probably also one of the fastest workflows out there. Now, the big thing with Blender is it has this reputation of, if you've got money, use an Autodesk product. If you don't, use Blender. And that is unfair. Blender is getting up there with Max and Maya for feature parity. It is honestly a peer to those two programs. And perhaps most impressively, in the last probably 4 or 5 years, each time a new version, and now they're on like an annual release cycle, each new year of Autodesk products brings a couple bullet point features. Like the product is kind of stagnating a bit, especially Autodesk. 3D Studios Max. Like I said, they're just bundling crap on top of what's already there. So you have a huge need for a house cleaning, and code-wise, and like the source code that these things are built on, there was a Maya was a major rewrite back in 1998. Max was ported over to Windows in 96. So we're talking 15 plus years in the existing code base. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's all kinds of software that's built on code, that's built on code, that's built on code. But it's these fresh rewrites, like what Maya did from Power Animator to be Maya, makes it fresh and new and a good base to be built on. Softimage went through the same thing when it was rebuilt as Softimage XSI. And ironically, of the three packages, its underpinnings were probably the most modern. Blender itself essentially just went through a huge underneath the surface rewrite. Of the three packages out there that you really choose from, Max, Maya, and Blender, Blender's probably the most modern underneath, which is kind of ironic. But that's the way it is. From 2.4, it sat at this 2.4 version for the longest time, and 2.4 is what a lot of people remember when they think of Blender. It was an awkward interface where the face only a mom could love. Like, it was that kind of a program. It started as an in-house tool that evolved into a product that was released, and so on and so forth. But 2.5 was a massive rewrite of that, where they redid the UI, the workflow, and all that. And then 2.6 kind of took that one step further, started adding in features like B-Mesh. And I know it's way beyond this conversation, but they started adding these features that made Blender kind of catch up with its competitors. And they did it through also dog fooding, which is the process of using your own product in production environment. So what they started doing was they started releasing games and films. There was the big one was Sintel, Tears of Steel, I believe another one was called. Each year they would do a big project to push development of features and functionality in Blender. They've been doing this for a couple of years, and it's had a huge effect. Now we're into the 2.7 releases, and Blender generally gets a point version release every 6 weeks, 8 weeks. It's developing very fast, and it's kind of impressive what's coming in there. So you should not judge Blender from a general wishy-washy sort of background impression people have it. Blender is an awkward program to use initially, but like I said, once you get it, it fits like a glove. It is a great program that is, in every way, in all honesty, a peer to Max and Maya. However, it is just not used in production nearly as much. And one of the big issues there is actually, and the biggest flaw with Blender right now, is getting things in and out of it. As I said earlier, Max, Maya, and Softimage all spoke the same language. Behind the scenes, they use something called FBX, which is an interchange format that they use for going between all their different programs. It's a binary. It's owned by Autodesk, basically, and they create an exporter for people that want to use it in their own products. Now, the problem is Blender, and I haven't mentioned this yet, is free and open source. However, that open source library doesn't go hand in hand with FBX license version. So, unfortunately, Blender have had to clean room develop their version of FBX. What clean room basically means is no awareness of the standard itself. They just kind of play with it, reverse engineer it, and try to figure out how to do it. That way they're not in patent or license violation for creating their own. The problem is it kind of sucks as a result. So moving your model from Blender sorry, from Max to Maya is a no-brainer. Or Max Maya to Unity or Unreal or whatever. It's a no-brainer because FBX, they will just link to the FBX binary. It goes in FBX, it stays the same, it works just great. You can't say the same about Autodesk. Sorry, you can't say the same about Blender. Getting files in and out of Blender is a bit more challenging. Now, this is an area of focus. If you go to the linked thing, I've got some links that are actually directly on this topic. Unreal, the Unreal Engine folks, recently kicked in 10 grand to work on FBX development for getting things out. So this is an area they're working on. It should improve in time. But just be aware, if you are working with Blender, it doesn't slot into a tool chain quite as well as the Autodesk tools as well as the Autodesk tools do. At the same time, functionally, it's got its strengths and weaknesses. It's remarkably powerful in what it does. You could do modeling, animation, texturing, special effects, compositing, pretty much everything you can think of to do in any of the other packages. They can be done in Blender. One of the areas Blender used to kind of sucks was its modeling tools. This is where in 2.6 releases and going into 2.7, they have improved massively to the point where actually of all three packages for polygonal modeling, I prefer Blender now. So it's a product that's really improved. And then once again, this is hard to ignore. It is completely free. It is open source, and it's updated every 2 months. So it's certainly worth checking out. You go ahead and download it. One other key thing here is, and I haven't touched on this yet, 3D Studios Max is Windows only. Always has been, probably always will be. Maya is available for Windows and Mac OS. It was, I believe, available for Linux for a very short period of time, but I don't know what happened to that. Now, Blender is available for everything. Quite literally, it's open source. It's been released on just about every platform you can think to. There's featured and unsupported versions of it, but it is on just about every. The only platform that it's not on, which I find kind of shocking, nobody's done a port yet, is iOS. But if you're running Linux, any of the different varieties of Linux or Unix generally these days, Windows or Mac, maybe even Amiga still, a Blender works. So Blender is an impressively cross-platform product, definitely one of its strengths. So once again, summarize. Max is only Windows, Maya is Windows and Mac OS, and then Blender is anything and everything except for iOS for some reason, or Android. So those are the big four. The reality is, if you're looking at getting into a general purpose product, if you've got the budget, you're trying to get good work on your if you're working on a CV, trying to get into a studio, or you're a student and you can get it for free, if you want to work in games, 3 Studios Max probably makes the most sense. If you're a hobbyist just looking to screw around, or you're not looking to get into a studio, you just want to create stuff for your game, check out Blender. It is perfectly capable of making any kind of video game you want. It's no worse than the other two. It's a great product. It's just, if you're in the market to actually get a job, of the 3 I'm talking about, it's the least impressive to be on your CV. It's a great program, but I can't honestly tell you to go down that road if you're trying to get work. Now, on the other hand, if you have an incredible demo reel, what program you made it in doesn't matter. A good studio will hire you by your volume of work or your body of work. But the reality is most people don't have a really great demo reel. In that case, having that bullet point on your resume that says 3D Studios Max as opposed to Blender is definitely in your favor. But again, it's completely free. It's getting better at communicating with other tools. It's improving, like I said, better than all of the existing products. It's definitely worth checking out. Even if you work for a living in one of these other packages, check out Blender. It may surprise you how impressive it's gotten. So those are your big 3.5 general purpose 3D packages, but that's by no means the end of it. One other strong area, a really big area in the world right now, is sculpting. And it started off with our next program here. And this is ZBrush. ZBrush started probably 10 years ago. And it was this 3D blob kind of virtual clay sculpting solution. And since then, it's been refined, and it is being used all over the place. And the biggest thing that it's used for is super high resolution models, sort of like what you see here. This is the kind of work people are doing with ZBrush. And the workflow is fast. It's really like working with virtual clay. And since the success of ZBrush, you've actually started seeing sculpting being added to all the other packages. So you can sculpt in Maya, you can sculpt in Max, you can sculpt in Blender, but none of them do it nearly as well as ZBrush. On the other hand, ZBrush also has a price tag attached. It's not outrageous, but it is, let me try to remember, it's between it's $800. So it's not something you buy lightly. However, if you're a professional artist doing very high resolution meshes, ZBrush is uber popular. Now, the thing is, you might sit there and go, oh, I'm working with games. I don't need high resolution meshes. Like, they're kind of the bad thing. Well, the truth is, most modern games are actually using low to medium resolution meshes, but they're using something called a normal map, which is, to nutshell kind of butcher description, what you do is you create a super high resolution version of a model and then a low resolution version of it, and they take the high level version and you render something called a normal map, which is like, it figures out the lighting for all the creases and nooks and crannies that added detail would add it, and it turns it into a texture map. So then you apply it to a low resolution version of it, and normal maps are becoming the norm on, definitely for AAA games. Almost everything on a PC now. Mobile hardware is a little iffy on normal map support, but it's becoming the norm there too, pun not intended. So even if you're working in real-time games, or possibly even especially if you're working in real-time games, high resolution, fast to generate versions can definitely be of value. And then the next thing you get into is there's something called retopology. And what you do there is you model your initial version with no regard to the total polygon count. It doesn't matter at all. You just play with virtual clay, add as much detail as you want, work as fast as you want, and create the shape you want. And then what you do is you use retopology, which more or less can be thought of like using tracing paper, but in 3D. And you draw a nice low resolution version on top of the high resolution that you're starting with. And then so you get the basic shape and outline from the original, trace over it, and create a much lower polygon count version that's used in your game. So what's very common workflow, again, create the high resolution version, render a normal map for it, use retopology to trace over it and make a low resolution version, and then apply that normal map to it. And this is something that is very, very, very commonly done these days. So if you're just starting out, by no means start with ZBrush. It's down the road. It's one of those things that it's definitely a skill that's of use for you to have. If you have access to ZBrush, definitely learn it. It is an incredibly fun application to play with. It's something that you can pick up and learn very quickly, but it is not general purpose. It's a very specialized skill, and it's something from somewhat down the road for your career. However, there's this neat little program called Sculptris. Sculptris, as you may notice from me switching between pages here, is made by the exact same company, Pixelogic. Now what happened is there was a guy that started off when ZBrush came out, and he's like, wow, that's awesome. I wonder if I can make one. And he did. He made Sculptris, which is kind of like a light version of ZBrush. And the cool thing is, the ZBrush folks, Pixelogic, actually bought this guy up, or hired him on, or however that works when you're not really a company. And then they started releasing Sculptris as a free product. So it's kind of ZBrush Lite. It's not a demo, by all means. You can definitely use this in a commercial game. There are no licensing restrictions. Just go in and have fun. Do this yesterday. Like, download Sculptris, even if it's just a fun way to kill an afternoon. This shows you kind of how the workflow and process works from ZBrush, but for completely free. It's a fun program to play with. You will be amazed at how fast you can get stuff working and going. So go check out Sculptris. Now, at the same time, Autodesk, not to be outdone, also has a product in the 3D sculpting space, and it's called Mudbox. I honestly don't know much about Mudbox. I know it started life at Weta, whoever, Peter Jackson's film production company out in New Zealand. The people behind King Kong, Lord of the Rings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Weta Digital, kind of a couple guys on the team, started this sculpting program there, and then it got spun off into its own product, and then Autodesk bought it up, and they're now selling it as Mudbox. It's very much like ZBrush. To be honest, an artist friend pretty much described it as ZBrush, but crappier. So it's not really a ringing endorsement by any means. It's a little bit cheaper, I believe. I think it's around $500, or you can get it monthly for $10 a month. However, if you are a student, you can get it completely free. So if you're into sculpting and you're going to get an Autodesk package as a student anyways, be sure to check out Mudbox. Same deal, high resolution versions, quick clay, virtual clay-like modeling experience, and then you ultimately import it into another project to finish it off. There is another product out there called 3D Coat. If you're just starting off, 3D Coat doesn't make a lot of sense for you because it's not broad enough to hit all the buttons, but where it does is it nails 3 tasks. Sculpting, which we just talked about, sort of it's a competitor to Sculptris, ZBrush, and Mudbox. Retopology, it's got excellent retopology tools. So if you want to create a low resolution version from a high resolution thing, 3D Coat's a great choice. So if you're sculpting in that, and then the other thing it does is 3D texture painting, which is you can actually draw your texture map on top of the thing in 3D. Now, Maya and Blender actually have this functionality built in as well. I'm not sure if Max does. Max used to do it as a plugin. I imagine they've added it since. I'm not entirely certain. But this functionality is quite commonly available. So 3D Coat sort of specializes in it. So 3D Coat is another sculpting option with great retopology tools and texture painting built in. It's about $400. It's on Steam, however, so you can watch for it to be on sale. Sometimes there's some pretty insane sales on Steam. Just be careful, because Steam also has a version that's about $100, and that is no use to you. That's for creating content for like Team Fortress and such. I'm not even sure why they charge for it, but that's not the version you want. There's a pro version, and that's the only thing of any use. So just so you're aware of it, there is this package out here called 3D Coat as well. Now, back into, that's kind of all of the, so the big three, Max, Maya, and Softimage, plus Blender, the open source free competitor to those other three. And you got a couple of other ones that are kind of like on the cusp of becoming these guys. So the first one we're going to talk about here is called Modo. Modo is super popular among a certain group of people. It started life as a modeler, and it interestingly enough started life from a team spun off from a product called LightWave. Let's fast forward slightly and talk about LightWave. LightWave used to be huge. I mentioned it at the very beginning. It was the one that made a version available on Amiga. It kind of brought affordable 3D to the masses. There was a cult following. It had its own monthly magazine for the longest time. There was like thousands of users for LightWave. It definitely had a huge following. And then stuff happened. Two things I saw that I'm an outsider here, and I was never really much of a LightWave user myself, but it was really, really, really going strong. Like there was, like I said, Babylon 5 and all the Hercules and Xena type stuff. A lot of movies were using it. You go to their site, they've actually got a list somewhere of the people that are using it. It's pretty impressive, the people that were using it, and it all stopped. Now, two big things happened. Is there was an exodus of employees. A bunch of people left and went to make Modo. So I'll flip back to Modo in a second, but that's what LightWave, I'm not sure, I don't know the story behind it. All I know is something happened, a lot of the talent at LightWave left, and then they started working on something called LightWave Core, and it was going to be the next version, the next generation. That was many, many years ago, and it got folded into the main version, and the new version's out, but things just haven't evolved since. Like, as you can see from the webpage, there's a 2015 release out, but if you look at like what's new, and what's new since LightWave 11, which is a number of years old, to now, there's nothing. Like it's moving at a glacial pace, and I think it is because a lot of the real people behind the program, the real people that were pushing it, are now over at Modo. So that's LightWave. It's about $1,000. It's definitely capable. It doesn't have a huge community. It seems to be dying off a bit. I personally don't recommend it, but it is one of those programs that does everything like Max, Maya, Softimage, Blender, all those. So that's LightWave, and it led to Modo. Modo started life as a pure modeler, and there's a lot of people that loved it as the cleanest modeling tool. I've not actually used Modo much. I downloaded the trial years ago. It has its fans. I didn't really get that into it, but there definitely are people that follow it and love it. Now, what's happened over time since Modo did that is instead of just being a modeler, they started adding functionality on top. They added the basics of animation, then they added a little bit more functionality for the animation. They added a renderer. So slowly over time, it's turning into a full 3D package to compete with the likes of 3D Studios Max and Maya. Its price tag is also slowly going up too. So it's now up to €1,000, so about 1,200 probably American right now. I'm not sure what exchange rates are currently doing, but see if this pop-up tells us. Ah, wow, exchange rates are a lot worse than they are. Oh, and that is pounds. All right, sorry. So it's about £1,000 or $1,500 right now. It used to be 700, 600 kind of thing. So it's slowly going on. It's increasing in scope and it's increasing in price. Eventually, it will probably be a peer to Max and Maya. So it's definitely one to keep an eye on. Also, Modo is used in a lot of studios. If you go back to their webpage, I think they have a link into all the people that, a lot of people that are recommending it. It slots well into the workflow for other projects. So it is something that if you show Modo on your resume, there is value there. But if you're having to choose between Modo or Max or Maya, I would have to say Max or Maya are your best fit. If you're just working for productivity, definitely download the trial. Try Modo out. Like I said, it has some very rabid fans. So that's Modo. Eventually, this will be a full-blown suite, but there are still a couple features lacking, and then some of the features, like animation, since they're somewhat new, aren't as fully fleshed out or developed as you see in these other packages. Next up, we got SketchUp. SketchUp I'm only mentioning very, very briefly, just because it actually seems to have a bit of a niche in game development. It's a bit of a weird product. It started life as, it's sort of for 3D-izing 2D stuff. As you can see from the shots in front of you, you're seeing lofted out versions of 2D blueprints, and that seems to be the purpose behind SketchUp. And Google bought it a number of years ago, and the whole idea was they were going to give it away for people to start making virtual Earth models. I don't know if anybody actually did this, but I know there's a huge catalog of virtual Earth 3D stuff, so obviously people were out doing it. Eventually Google got sick of it, spun it off, and SketchUp is now its own company again. And this program is available in two different versions. There's, what do they call them? Pro and Make. Make is free. You can go in and download it. The biggest difference you can find between the two is you can play around as much as you want in Make, but I think all the exporters are disabled, so it's actually of absolutely no use to you as a game developer unless you get those exporters. So that's the Pro version. The Pro version is between $500 and $600. Now, I do mention SketchUp because it is being used more and more often. Like if you search, well, for one, if you go to their website, they do have games industry. Let's see. Listed with a couple of case studies with videos, and you'll see here like Massive Black and Uncharted are using SketchUp. And I've seen a lot of indie things. Why I mention it specifically in this write-up is there were a couple of articles, like there was one on Gamma Sutra a while back about a guy that used SketchUp for doing like quick prototyping to bring things in. And I've played around with SketchUp. You can go download the Make version and you'll see what I mean. It is probably hands down the easiest modeling experience you can get. Now, same time, you're not necessarily making the cleanest, nicest meshes you've ever seen, but the workflow is fast. So if you're looking for just a model or for getting concepts designs out, SketchUp is definitely something to look into. As you see here, the Pro version can get it out to all these different versions. The key one, again, is that FBX, and then Collada is like an industry standard. Actually, it's probably what Blender's best support is for input-output. And Unity supports Collada. So Collada is an important format, and you can get it in and out of these programs as a result of Collada. So SketchUp is probably one of the fastest prototyping modelers you can get, but that's all it is. It is just a modeler. So by no means should this be your first package or where you focus on, but if you just want to knock things up in 3D, SketchUp is definitely worth checking out. Next up, we have a product. I'm only going to touch on this one very briefly. It's called Silo. Silo could have been awesome, and I'm using past tense here, unfortunately. As you can see from on page, it's $110, and it's probably comparable to Modo in functionality. There's basic animation in there, texturing, modeling, rendering, but that's it. It's not a full-blown 3D package yet, and I may have just lied about rendering. I'm not sure. It's been a while. But mostly Silo is focused around 3D modeling, and it's a subdivision modeler, which is sort of it's the process that most people are actually using these days for creating real detailed models using low polygons that you then subdivide and make nice and smooth, or use multi-resolution versions of it. So that is the common approach to things. Silo was around about 4 years ago, and it used to be about $200, and it was amazing. And then they just stopped developing it. So for about 3 years, there was no updates, no nothing, no activity from the developers, nothing. And then just recently, it popped up on Steam for sale, and they did a 0.1 increment, so they released version 2.3, which was a couple of bug fixes, brings some of the libraries like Qt and such up to the modern version, and that's it. So it's not really an actively developed product. It was a bit buggy when I used it 3, 4, 5 years ago. It hasn't really been improved on since, unfortunately, because it's an impressive package with a really good price tag. And had they been developing it for the past 5 years, it would be great. But in this day and age, with the improvements that I've seen to Blender, I just can't really justify spending that money anymore. Another one that falls under the used to be awesome category was Wings. Wings was a neat little thing. It actually used a process called winged edge modeling, which is a difference than a traditional polygon for allowing more detailed multi-sided faces and such. It's a mathematical thing behind the scenes, but it allowed you to really use a slightly different workflow. For low polygon work, it was a great program to use. It was actually based on an older program called Nendo, made by a company called Nichimen, long since defunct. There's a company linked off the document that I linked in the comments called Isware selling it, but it is 10 years old at this point. But the workflow was amazingly simple. It was like sculpting in polygons, and Wings was sort of an open source successor to that, and Wings was going wonderfully. Now the kicker is Wings was written in Erlang. Nobody programs in Erlang. It's used mostly in the telecom industry. It's an impressive language, to what my understanding is. I actually don't understand it. I don't know. I don't generally go for functional programming that much, other than a little bit of like C# and F#. So it's not my thing, and unfortunately, it's not really anyone else's things either. So when the developer of Wings sort of took a sabbatical about 3 or 4 years ago, development stopped. And unfortunately, that kind of seems to be where it is. Like, there's a couple guys keeping it alive, but it's not really advancing much, which is a shame. It's definitely worth checking out. The workflow might be exactly perfect for you. It's completely free. You've got some of the easiest texture mapping and modeling you've ever seen, and that's literally all it does. So head on over and download it. You've got nothing to lose. It's, I believe it's available on a couple of platforms. Yeah, there we go. So pretty much your Windows, Mac, and your Linuxes. It is a cool program that is just sort of getting left behind, and another casualty of Blender getting so much better is why would you work in something else when Wings is available for you? Sorry, when Blender's good enough. And that's kind of hurting it a bit. And of course, the lack of active development is hurting it the most. But it is a neat program, definitely something you should consider checking out. Next up is Cinema 4D, sorry. I'm mentioning this one for thoroughness. This program has been around forever. It's up to release 15 or 16 now. It's a full-blown 3D package, just like Max Maya Softimage Blender. I don't get the point. It's not cheap by any definition of the word. In fact, it's $3,700. I think there's a loyal following in Germany. I don't honestly know why this program is still going strong like it is. But again, I'm mentioning it for thoroughness. If you want to check it out, you can. I believe there is a demo version available for it. The next one we're talking about again is Houdini from Side Effects. Houdini is a procedural-based program, and that's about all I know. To be honest, I've downloaded the demo. They made a version called Apprentice a couple years back. I downloaded it then. I downloaded it again just when I was putting this thing together, and I can't figure it out. I don't really consider myself a stupid person by any definition of the word, but my brain just can't wrap itself around Houdini. Again, I'm mentioning this for thoroughness. This is another full 3D package, but it takes a procedural, built-up approach, so it's really strong in creating large scenes, special effects, really advanced particle stuff. It's used heavily in movies for special effects. It is very strongly used, and they've recently released Houdini Indie, which is a $200 version for people that make a certain amount of money. So it's a very affordable package if you make less than $100,000 a year. And they've got Houdini Engine for embedding Houdini itself into games. So it's definitely something that's worth checking out. But my brain honestly cannot wrap it around Houdini. So Yeah, I'm just letting you know so you can do further research here because I don't personally get this program. And finally, once again, for the sake of being thorough, there's a program out there called Martin Hash Animation Master. It's about, you can buy it for about $70 a year, so it's definitely affordable. It's full modeling, animating, rendering, all in this package. It's completely different. It's kind of a throwback to the way we used to do things 10 years ago. It's spline-based, patch-based, which you sort of, instead of working with polygons, you're working with splines or lines, and you sort of draw like a lattice or a cage of what you want to make in 3D. It's somewhat gone out of vogue in other packages, but it is sort of the fundamental of Animation Master. It's a cool little package. I played with it like 9 years ago, and they're still pumping out new versions. It was very easy to get into. The animation tools were some of the easiest I've ever seen. If you're going for that cartoony look, or the workflow just fits you, it may be worth checking out. There's a trial available, but it's the most annoying trial instructions I've ever seen in my life. So you have to install the license manager, configure it a certain way, request the version, and so on and so forth. So it's a pain in the butt to get into. But there is a trial version available. And again, it's $80 a year or $300 to buy it outright. So it's a very affordable package. The workflow is very different from probably what you are expecting from any of these other packages. But it's an alternative. And if its workflow fits you, it might be absolutely perfect for you. And then finally, and I didn't mention this on the webpage, so I completely forget about it, to be honest, there's a package out there called Shade from Miri. I know nothing about this. It's been around for a very, very long time. It has horrible documentation when I went to look at it before. They've done some indie-friendly movements lately. They've made a Unity-oriented version, which I believe is actually free. So you definitely download. It's a complete package. I think it's from Japan. I think it just isn't really marketed here that much. The information is pretty sparse. I don't really know much about this package at all, but it's definitely worth checking out just so you have a complete history. And that's pretty much every package, at least I can currently think of. Summarized though, if you're looking now to get into 3D, it ultimately depends on why. Now, each of these tools fits differently. I've had access to a number of them. At the end of the day, my personal uses, I actually go and use Blender. I like Blender. I like the Blender workflow. At the same time, I'm primarily a programmer that makes art for myself. I've been a hobbyist in this stuff for, like I said, I bought 3D Studios back in college many, many years ago. I'm not going to date myself, but it was a long time back. And I have followed this industry for about as long as this industry has existed. But I don't work every day in it. And even then, you kind of buy the tool that fits you best. Now, the sad thing is, if you're just sitting out there day one trying to figure out this whole 3D thing, you've got no real perspective on how one compares with the other. And the only way to really get it is to use it. If you are looking to just create stuff for your game, if you're not doing this for a resume or a job in the industry, you don't want to make AAA games or AAA games for someone else or work in films or whatever, the first thing you should do is, the minute this is done, is go download Blender. Seriously, Gamefromscratch, there's a thing on, I've got a multi-part tutorial that will actually walk you from very beginning to creating game-ready assets and play with it. The workflow, once you get it, is great. If you're looking at creating games for your thing, you have a budget, ultimately it comes down to what tools work the best. In the grand scheme of things, you know, I sit here and go, wow, $4,000. I don't want to spend $4,000 on a license. At the same time, once you start talking employees, what's $4,000? Like, to be honest, like if you've got an entry-level artist making, even in the worst market, $40,000 a year, that's like 5 weeks, 6 weeks worth of work of pay to pay for that license. Once you start talking a workplace environment and such, then the licensing costs become kind of a joke. However, if you're working for yourself, use what works best for you. If you're working to get a job in the industry, you're a student or whatever, well, if you are a student, you should definitely check out the Autodesk stuff. because it is available for completely free to you. Autodesk is the name. It is what HR people will look for in a resume, so if you're trying to decide what to work with, that's probably where you want to go. Now, as to which ones you want to use, again, it comes down to what glove fits the best. And there is a massively different workflow between all three of those products I just mentioned, the Max Maya and Blender. They all work very differently. Maya is lots of menus, radial menus, click around your mouse, lots of mouse clicks kind of workflow, but also probably the most tactile, hands-on, artisty tool of the bunch. Blender, on the other hand, is very keyboard-centric. I think it appeals to me as a programmer because of that. I can control with great precision moving transforms, scales, 100% on the keyboard. It's kind of an impressive thing. And once you actually get the workflow down, it is very, very fast. It's sort of like how certain programs out there live and swear by Vi or Emacs, even though there's so many different options since. Once you get that workflow down, if you are a power user on the keyboard focus, you cannot beat Blender. Max, on the other hand, is somewhere in between the two. If you're looking at getting into making AAA games, I think the number one recommendation I can give to you, if you are a student, is go learn 3D Studios Max. If you want to get into film or art in general, try Max or Maya. Either could work, but of course pick up Blender too. There's no cost involved. There's nothing to be lost, and you may be like me and find that that is the workflow that fits you the best. You can probably create just about anything in just about any of those three packages I just mentioned. So functionality is no longer the barrier of entry. Pick one up, try it out. Now, the nice thing is, again, Blender has no cost at all, so there is no barrier of entry there other than the time you've invested in it. If you're working on your own project and Blender does what you want, that's great. You're not really missing anything by not having Max or Maya. So you can definitely go down the Blender road and never leave it. If you're looking to get a job, Blender may not be the best place to focus. Instead, Max or Maya would definitely be where to look at. But this is pretty much a broad introduction to the 3D industry as it stands today, and a little bit of a history lesson thrown in. I hope that was interesting. I hope that was useful. Thanks for listening.